It was late October when I moved to the village. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business, and the silence between the houses was so thick it felt suffocating. I had rented an old cottage at the edge of town, far from the central square, hoping to find peace after a hectic few years in the city. The neighbors were polite, but distant, and most of them went about their business without much interaction. Days passed slowly, and I settled into a routine. Mornings were crisp, and I'd walk around the perimeter of the cottage, the land stretching out in front of me. There was a forest at the back, the trees heavy with fall's first chill. Occasionally, I'd hear something rustling out there, but I figured it was just deer or some other animal. I never thought much of it, but then, one evening, after coming back from the market, I noticed something odd. A pile of rocks near the tree line, almost like a small wall. It was out of place, and it bugged me. No one had mentioned anything about it, and there was nothing in the village that explained it. I decided to leave it alone at first. After all, I was new here, and maybe there was a simple explanation. But that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I went to bed early, but sleep didn't come easily. Every time I started to drift off, I would hear the faintest sound, scratching, like nails on wood. At first, I convinced myself it was just the house settling. But the sounds grew louder each night. Then I started noticing things out of place. My door slightly ajar in the mornings, tools from my shed moved, small things I couldn't quite put my finger on. I decided to investigate the pile of rocks in the forest. One evening, after the sun dipped below the horizon, I walked out there with a flashlight. The light flickered against the trees as I got closer to the strange pile. As I crouched down to inspect it, I realized the rocks weren't just piled up haphazardly, they formed a pattern. A ring. My stomach sank. Something about it felt wrong. I turned to leave, but the sound I had been hearing, that scraping noise, came again, this time closer, much closer. My heart pounded in my chest. I spun around, flashlight shaking in my hand, but I saw nothing. The night air was still. That's when I saw it. Not far off, behind a thick cluster of trees, was a figure. The silhouette was still, barely visible in the fading light. I knew at that moment that I wasn't alone. I ran. I didn't care how stupid it seemed, I just ran back to my cottage. When I got inside, I locked every window and door, not stopping to take a breath. I didn't sleep that night, just staring at the walls, listening. Nothing else happened. In the days that followed, I decided I'd had enough. I couldn't stay here anymore, not with that feeling gnawing at me. I packed up my things and left, leaving the village behind. A month later, I heard from a local that the house I had rented was built on land that had been abandoned for generations. The rocks? They were markers, ancient ones, left behind by people long gone. No one talked about them, not openly. I don't know what happened to the figure I saw, or what I heard that night, but I never went back. I figured some things are better left buried in the past, where they belong. The village I moved to had always been quiet. Too quiet. I'd heard the usual warnings from people who'd visited, but I shrugged them off. You know how it is, small town gossip. They said the place was strange, not like other places, but it all seemed fine to me when I first arrived. The house I rented was on the edge of the village, a little outside the main area where most people lived. It was small, old, with cracked windows and a rusted gate. But it was cheap, and I didn't mind. The peace was a welcome change from the noise of the city. The first few weeks were uneventful. I got to know the locals, mostly farmers, some shopkeepers, and a few families who'd lived there for generations. They were polite, but distant, and I felt like an outsider, which didn't bother me much. I kept to myself mostly, keeping busy with work and little projects around the house. But then, things started to feel off. At night, when I sat by the window with a book, or watched the moonlight filter through the trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't really alone. It wasn't something you could point to, just a sense of being watched. I tried to ignore it, but it stayed. One evening, I decided to take a walk to clear my mind. The path that led from my house into the village was narrow, barely wide enough for a single person. As I walked, I noticed the shadows seemed thicker in the trees. The air was still, too still. No rustling of leaves, no chirping of insects. Just silence. I passed the other houses, old, some of them abandoned, but the lights were always on. Always. It was unsettling, the kind of thing that would make anyone question their own thoughts. I shrugged it off, convincing myself it was nothing, just the isolation getting to me, but then I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. Up ahead, near the village square, there was a figure standing still. It was a man, tall and thin, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. I thought maybe he was waiting for someone, but there was something about his stillness that made my heart race. He didn't move, didn't blink. Just stood there, like a statue. I tried to walk past, my gaze fixed on the ground, hoping he'd go away. But as I got closer, I heard it, a soft, slow scraping sound, like boots dragging on dirt. I didn't dare look up, but I felt his presence growing nearer, like he was right behind me. I picked up my pace, but I could feel him getting closer. Every instinct told me to run, but I didn't want to look like I was panicking. Finally, I reached the edge of the square, where a couple of people stood outside a small pub. The figure stopped, just short of them, and I dared a quick glance over my shoulder. He hadn't followed me, but the air still felt thick, like something wasn't right. The next day, I packed up and decided to leave the village. I'd had enough. I went into the local store to grab some supplies for the road, and the shopkeeper, a woman with graying hair, looked at me with a strange, almost pitying look as I checked out. "You're leaving, then?" she asked. I nodded, not trusting my voice. She didn't say anything else, but as I walked out, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. On the porch of the store, there was an old, weathered photograph pinned to the wall. It was a group photo, taken decades ago. In the middle of the picture was a man, tall and thin, wearing a wide-brimmed hat, the same man from last night. I left the village that afternoon, and as I drove away, I felt the weight of something lift. I didn't know what it was exactly, but I knew I was safer out of there. I never looked back, and I never went back. I still don't know what happened in that village, or why the people acted so strange. But I learned one thing: some places are just wrong, and once you feel it, there's no turning back. I haven't been able to shake the memory of that man, standing alone in the village square. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I do know one thing: sometimes the quietest places are the most dangerous. It was a quiet morning when I first noticed something odd about the village. I had just moved here, thinking it would be a peaceful place to start fresh, away from the noise and bustle of the city. The people were friendly enough, but there was something strange about the way they acted sometimes. They smiled too much, as if they were hiding something. At first, I shrugged it off. It was a small village, and everyone knows everyone else. Maybe that made them a little too close, a little too comfortable. But as the days passed, I started to see things that didn't sit right with me. It was subtle at first, the way the villagers seemed to avoid certain areas, like the old woods at the edge of town, or the abandoned house on the hill. No one talked about these places, not directly. If you asked about them, the conversation would shift quickly to something else, a bit too quickly. One evening, I decided to take a walk through the woods. I had heard stories from the locals, stories about how the woods were haunted or cursed, but no one ever said exactly why. I was curious, so I went anyway. The air felt heavier as I walked deeper into the trees, and I could feel the silence pressing against me. No birds, no rustling leaves, just that eerie stillness that made the hairs on my neck stand up. I kept walking, my feet crunching over the dry leaves, until I found a small clearing. That's when I saw it, a stone marker, half hidden by overgrown plants. It looked old, like it had been there for centuries. I couldn't help myself. I stepped closer. The moment my fingers brushed against the cold stone, something strange happened. A feeling washed over me, like I was being watched, like the air itself was holding its breath. I quickly backed away, heart racing. Something wasn't right. When I got back to the village, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had disturbed something. That night, sleep didn't come easy. I lay in bed, eyes wide open, listening to the quiet. Then, I heard it, a faint noise, like someone scratching at the window. My heart skipped. I didn't move. I didn't dare. The scratching continued, slow and deliberate, until it stopped. The next morning, I asked one of the villagers about the woods. They didn't seem surprised. Just said it was best to leave certain things alone, that some parts of the land were not for us. But the way they said it, so calmly, made my blood run cold. It was as if they knew exactly what I was talking about, as if they were waiting for me to ask. I tried to forget about the woods, but every time I walked around the village, I felt eyes on me. I never thought a small village could be so unsettling. I moved here for the quiet, away from the noise of the city, thinking it would be a peaceful life. But from the moment I arrived, things felt off. The village was tucked away in a valley, surrounded by dense forests and rolling hills. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and nothing ever seemed to change. The houses were old, and the streets were narrow and crooked. The people, though kind, always seemed to look at me a little too long when I walked past. At first, I told myself it was just because I was new. I noticed something strange about the village schedule. Every evening, just before sunset, the streets would empty out. No one was ever out after dark. I asked an older man once why that was, and he just gave me a vague answer about the village being safer at night if you stay inside. But when I asked why, his face went pale, and he quickly changed the subject. One night, I decided to stay up late. I wanted to see for myself what happened after dark. So, I sat by my window, watching the empty streets. At first, nothing happened. But as the moon climbed higher, I started hearing sounds, faint rustling, like footsteps on gravel. It wasn't normal. It was too quiet, like the air itself was holding its breath. I pulled the curtain aside just a crack, and that's when I saw them. A group of people, all wearing dark, weathered clothes, walking down the road. They didn't speak, didn't make a sound, just moved slowly in a line. The strange thing was, their faces were obscured, not by masks, but by the way they hunched their heads, as though they didn't want to be seen. They seemed to know exactly where they were going, like they were headed for something. Or someone. I froze, unsure of what to do. Part of me wanted to go out and ask them what was going on, but a stronger part of me told me to stay inside. So, I watched from my window as they disappeared down the road, heading toward the old barn at the edge of the village. I knew the barn had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember. The place was falling apart, the roof caving in. Why would they be going there? The next day, I asked one of the villagers about the barn, and the look in her eyes made my stomach turn. She quickly dismissed it, saying it was a dangerous place, best left alone. But there was fear in her voice. The same kind of fear I had seen in the older man's face when I'd asked about the village's strange customs. The more I thought about it, the more I became convinced that there was something dark happening in this village, something no one wanted to talk about. So, I decided to go to the barn myself. That evening, after sunset, I quietly slipped out of my house and made my way to the barn. It wasn't easy to get there, the path overgrown with weeds and brambles. The air felt heavy, like the world was holding its breath again. I reached the barn just as the sky turned dark. The door was slightly ajar. I hesitated, but pushed it open. Inside, the barn smelled of damp wood and old hay. I took a few steps inside, and that's when I heard it, a soft scraping sound, like something being dragged across the floor. I followed the noise, heart pounding, and found a trapdoor hidden under a pile of hay. It had been carefully covered, like someone didn't want it to be found. I pulled it open. What I saw made my blood run cold. There were rows of old, wooden crates stacked against the walls, some of them cracked open. But it wasn't the crates that got to me, it was what was inside them. They weren't filled with old tools or forgotten possessions, but with jars filled with dark, thick liquid. And inside those jars were things that looked too human to be anything else, but too twisted to be real. I don't know how long I stood there, staring, but suddenly I heard a noise behind me. I spun around, and there they were, the people I had seen last night, standing in the doorway. Their faces were still hidden, but they weren't the ones I feared. It was what they were guarding. In that moment, I understood. The village wasn't cursed, not in any supernatural sense. It was controlled by something far worse, fear. The villagers had been hiding this secret for generations. The barn was a place where they kept their shame, their sins, whatever it was that they had been hiding from the outside world. And they would do anything to protect it. I didn't say a word. I knew there was nothing I could say. I backed away slowly, and when I reached the door, I ran. I didn't look back. The next morning, I packed my things and left the village, never to return. I never spoke to anyone about what I saw. In fact, I never spoke of it again to anyone, not even to my family. The village has remained a secret in my mind, a place I escaped from. But sometimes, in the dead of night, when I'm lying in bed, I can still hear the soft scraping sound, the sound of something being dragged across a floor. And I wonder if I truly escaped at all. Maybe, I think, I never left. Maybe that place is still waiting for me. The village I grew up in was small, isolated, tucked away in a valley that felt like it was always a few steps behind the rest of the world. The roads were narrow and dirt-covered, lined with old stone houses that seemed to sag under the weight of time. There was something about the place that always felt off, though I couldn't put my finger on it for years. It wasn't that anything bad happened openly, but there was a quietness about the villagers, a way they kept to themselves, eyes a little too watchful, as though they were waiting for something to happen, but never really speaking about it. I was in my late teens when I started noticing the little things. There were always strange sounds at night, like someone walking around in the fields, or distant thumps from the woods. But when I asked anyone about it, they'd either change the subject or give a vague answer. Just the wind, they'd say. Or the forest can play tricks on your mind. But I wasn't stupid. It was something else, something more deliberate. It started with the lights. I'd be lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, when I'd see a flicker of light through my window, coming from the woods behind our house. It wasn't the light of a car or a torch. It was steady, almost like a lantern, but it would move too. I'd lie there, frozen, watching it sway from side to side. And then it would stop, as if whoever was out there was aware of me watching. At first, I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild. But over the weeks, it kept happening, always the same time, around midnight. I'd wake up, see the light, and hear footsteps, soft and slow, crunching on the frost. I felt like I was being watched, like there was something, or someone, waiting for me to do something, to acknowledge it. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a jacket and quietly left the house, walking toward the woods, heart pounding in my chest. The light was already there, bobbing through the trees like someone was walking just ahead of me. I followed it, keeping my distance, the dark forest closing in around me. It felt like the trees were watching too, their branches twisting in strange shapes, reaching down like they wanted to grab me. I kept moving until I reached a clearing, and that's when I saw it. There was a circle of stones, half covered with moss, and in the center, a fire burned low. No one was around. But there was something in the air, something heavy, like a weight pressing down on my chest. The firelight danced on the edges of the clearing, flickering and shifting in ways it shouldn't. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I turned to leave, but then I saw something in the shadows, Figures, standing still, their faces obscured by hoods. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I knew they were watching me. My heart raced as I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. I turned and ran, not stopping until I reached the edge of the village. I didn't look back. When I got home, I locked the door behind me, breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I couldn't understand what I'd seen, but I knew something was wrong. The village was hiding something. The next day, I decided to leave. I couldn't take it anymore, the feeling of being trapped in a place that didn't feel safe, a place where people whispered and avoided your eyes. But as I packed my things, I noticed something strange. There were no signs of life on the streets, no one walking, no children playing, no animals around. The village felt empty, quieter than it ever had before. As I stepped outside, ready to leave for good, I saw one of the villagers, an old man who'd always been kind to me. He was standing by the gate, looking at me, his face pale. I stopped, waiting for him to speak, but instead, he just nodded slowly. "It's better that you go," he said, his voice low. "There's nothing here for you." I didn't ask him what he meant. I didn't need to. I understood. I left that day, never looking back. And as I walked away from the village, I realized that it wasn't just the forest or the strange lights that made it terrifying, it was the silence of it all. The way the village seemed to breathe around you, waiting. Waiting for something to happen. Waiting for you to see the truth. And in the end, the truth was that some places are cursed in ways you can never understand. I'm not sure what the villagers were hiding, but I know now that the valley was never meant to be home. Sometimes, I still hear the sound of footsteps in the dark. But when I turn, there's no one there. The watcher in the woods. I moved to the village of Wexley, a place so quiet it felt like time itself slowed down. I needed peace after years of city life, and this remote spot seemed perfect. The houses were spaced out, surrounded by thick woods on all sides, with